Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, how has your evening settled tonight? Perhaps the lamplight is warm, a cup of tea rests nearby, and the world outside grows quiet. Dr. Watson often wrote in such still hours, when observation sharpened and thought moved gently across the page. If you enjoy these calm reflections, do subscribe to Watson's Margins. Now settle comfortably, for as Holmes believed, the smallest details often lead us nearest the truth. And should you wish to listen beyond the page, you'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify channel waiting in the video description below. Chapter 1. The Gentleman with the Disturbed Papers. It is not often that a case presents itself which manages, by the quiet peculiarity of its circumstances alone, to arrest the attention of Mr. Sherlock Holmes before a single word of explanation has been offered. The spring of 1895 had been an indolent season at Baker Street, and my friend had occupied the better part of 3 successive mornings in the pursuit of chemical experiments whose precise object he declined to share with me, though the acrid smell which had by then permeated every curtain in our sitting-room left little doubt that the experiments themselves were vigorous enough. I had called upon Holmes that Tuesday morning more out of habit than expectation, having found my own consulting rooms temporarily deprived of patients by reason of a chill that had settled upon the district. Holmes was at his bench when I entered, his back to me, his long fingers moving with that deliberate economy which I had come to recognise as belonging to his most concentrated moods. He did not turn at my entrance. "You look well, Watson," he said, without raising his head from a graduated flask he was examining against the light. "The slight improvement in your complexion suggests the remainder you've been insisting upon has done its work. Sit down. There is coffee on the mantelpiece. Do not move the blue notebook." I obliged him on all 3 points. The morning light fell pleasantly across the room, catching the dust that drifted perpetually above his papers, and I was content for some minutes to read my newspaper and allow him his silence. It was a fine, clear morning in late April, the kind that invites a man to believe London's fogs have been permanently banished, and the sounds that rose from Baker Street below were of an ordinary and reassuring character. It was therefore with a degree of surprise that I heard Holmes set down his flask with deliberate care, remove his apron with an efficiency that suggested a decision already made, and cross to the window. He stood looking down into the street. "There is a gentleman approaching, who has come some distance this morning, and is not accustomed to asking for assistance," Holmes observed. "His coat is of excellent quality, but has not been brushed. He has begun and abandoned the act of turning back at least twice since rounding the corner. He carries a portfolio beneath his arm, and he is, I should judge, a barrister." I joined him at the window. The figure below was indeed a well-built man of perhaps 55 years, with grey at his temples and the upright bearing of one long, accustomed to authority. His face, even at that distance, conveyed the look of a man under strain, the jaw set with determination, the eyes cast down in the manner of one rehearsing an argument he is not entirely confident of winning. "You can see all that from here?" I asked. "The portfolio alone suggests the law," Holmes replied, already moving toward his chair. "The hesitation suggests embarrassment. The uncharacteristic state of his coat suggests haste combined with distraction. The combination suggests a man of standing who has encountered something that has unsettled his habitual composure. Come, Watson, let us hear what has brought a barrister of excellent reputation to our door before 10 o'clock on a Tuesday." Within 3 minutes, Mrs. Hudson had shown the gentleman up, and he stood before us, a man whose bearing confirmed everything Holmes had observed from above. He introduced himself as Mr. Lionel Ainsworth, and I recognised the name at once as that of a barrister with a sound reputation in the civil courts. "Mr. Holmes," he said, accepting the chair Holmes indicated with a nod of gratitude, "I am not a man who makes a habit of consulting private detectives, and I confess that I have spent rather more of this morning than I care to admit convincing myself that my errand is not a foolish one." "It is not," said Holmes simply, settling himself into the opposite chair with his fingers pressed together. You have come about the papers of Sir Malcolm Beresford." Ainsworth stared at him with an expression I'd seen on a great many faces in that sitting room over the years, the particular arrested look of a man who has prepared a careful speech and finds it rendered instantly unnecessary. "Good Lord," he said at last, "how could you possibly? Your portfolio is marked with the stamp of a Surrey solicitor's office that I have encountered before, in connection with the Beresford Family Trust," Holmes said. "The report of Sir Malcolm's death appeared in yesterday's late edition. That you come to me so promptly, and in such a state of evident agitation, tells me the circumstances of that death have already disclosed something irregular. The rest is inference. Pray continue, Mr. Ainsworth." "You were about to explain the papers." Ainsworth drew a slow breath and collected himself with the practised composure of his profession. When he spoke, his account was methodical and precise. Sir Malcolm Beresford, he explained, had been a retired magistrate of considerable local distinction in Surrey, a man of 71 years, of sound constitution, and of unimpeachable civic reputation. He had died 2 days previously, discovered at his desk in the early morning hours by a housemaid, apparently of heart failure. There had been no alarm, no sign of disturbance, and his physician had been satisfied to certify the cause without reservation. "It is not the death itself that has brought me here," Ainsworth said, and here his composure faltered slightly. "It is what was found when the study was examined afterward." He explained that Sir Malcolm had been engaged in a private legal matter of an unusual kind. Some weeks before his death, he had requested from the county archives a set of original papers relating to an inquest conducted nearly 25 years earlier, an inquest over which he himself had presided as the sitting magistrate. The inquest had concerned the drowning death of a young factory owner named Thomas Kellard, a case which had been ruled accidental at the time, but which Sir Malcolm had apparently in his final years come to regard with unease. When his study was examined, Ainsworth continued, leaning forward in his chair, it was found that the documents had been interfered with, pages had been removed, as certain passages had been partially erased and rewritten in a cautious, ambiguous legal phrasing that effectively obscured the original content. A corner of one document had been burned in the fireplace. "And the interference occurred after Sir Malcolm's death?" Holmes asked. "That is my firm belief, yes. The documents were intact when his secretary last handled them, which was the afternoon before he died. Sir Malcolm was alone with them in his study that evening. By morning he was dead, and by the time I arrived to attend to the estate, the papers were in that condition. Yet no sign of forced entry. None. The household was apparently undisturbed throughout the night. The servants heard nothing. The doors were locked in the usual fashion." Holmes said nothing for a moment. He rose from his chair and moved to the window once more, his hands clasped behind his back. Outside, Baker Street continued its indifferent morning commerce. "What is it that you fear, Mr. Ainsworth?" Holmes asked without turning. The barrister paused. "I fear that someone within that house entered that study after Sir Malcolm was dead, altered documents that were intended to correct a 25-year-old miscarriage of justice, and did so with sufficient composure and legal knowledge to make the alterations appear, on a casual inspection, almost unremarkable." "Almost," Holmes repeated softly, and I heard in that single word the note of quiet interest that meant the case had engaged him. He turned. "We shall go to Surrey tomorrow morning, Watson. Mr. Ainsworth. I should be grateful if you would ensure that nothing further is disturbed and that the household remains assembled. I shall have questions for several of them, I think." As Ainsworth departed, I observed Holmes return to his bench, but he made no further move toward his chemicals. He stood looking at nothing in particular, in that state of inward abstraction which I had learned meant he was already, in his mind, examining the study at Beresford House, turning over the altered pages, noting the silences, tracing the invisible path that connected a death in the present to a drowning in the past. "What do you make of it?" I ventured. "I make nothing of it yet," Holmes replied, which was not quite true. "But it is curious, Watson, is it not, that a man should spend his final hours attempting to correct an old injustice? and that someone should take such very considerable pains to ensure that the correction died with him? He said no more that evening on the subject. But when I called the following morning, he was already dressed and waiting, and his eyes held that particular brightness which told me that the quiet spring had, at last, come to an end. Chapter 2. A House of Unquiet Witnesses. The train from Waterloo carried us into Surrey under a sky of pale, uncertain grey, the kind that cannot decide between cloud and clearness, and settles for neither. Holmes sat opposite me with a folded newspaper across his knee, which he had not opened since Victoria, his gaze directed at the passing landscape with that quality of attention that is not quite observation, and not quite thought, but some private compound of the two which I had long since ceased to interrupt. I had brought my notebook, as was my habit, and occupied myself with setting down the principal facts of Ainsworth's account, in a form clear enough to consult at need. Holmes, I knew, required no such aid. He carried the relevant details within him as a physician carries anatomy, not as memorized particulars, but as a living structure whose every element implied the next. Beresford House stood at the end of a lane of copper beeches some 2 miles beyond the village of Thurlow Cross, a handsome stone property of the previous century set well back from the road behind iron gates and a modest park. It wore its age with the quiet confidence of a house that has never been obliged to impress anyone, and under other circumstances I should have found it entirely agreeable. As our cab turned through the gates, however, I was struck by the stillness of the place, a stillness that seemed less the peace of a country house than the suspended quiet of a household holding its breath. Ainsworth met us at the door. He had the look of a man who had passed a difficult night and was determined not to show it, and he greeted us with a brisk efficiency that I suspected was the only armour he currently had to hand. "They are all here," he said quietly, drawing us into the entrance hall. "I impressed upon them that your visit was a necessary formality in connection with the estate, and for the present they appear to accept that." "Capital," said Holmes, removing his coat and handing it to the waiting housemaid without looking at her. His eyes had already begun their quiet work, moving across the hall with the swift, unhurried economy of a surveyor who has walked many such rooms and knows precisely what to value. He paused briefly at the study door, which stood closed to our left, then turned away from it, and I understood that he intended to leave that room for last. "Introduce us, if you please," he said to Ainsworth, casually, in whatever order seems natural. "I should prefer not to begin with interviews." The party assembled in the drawing-room was, taken individually, unremarkable enough. It was their collective atmosphere that told the more instructive story. 5 people sat or stood in various attitudes of ostensible composure, and the composure of each was of a slightly different manufacture. Mrs. Eleanor Beresford, the widow, lodged us, was a handsome woman of 68, erect and self-possessed in the manner of one reared to regard the display of feeling as a form of discourtesy. She received Holmes's introduction with a graciousness that was entirely correct and entirely impenetrable. Her hands, I noticed, were still in her lap with a deliberateness that suggested they might not be still if left to themselves. Dr. Edwin Halcombe was a heavy-set man of 70, ruddy and white-whiskered, with the practised bonhomie of a country physician long accustomed to being the most trusted presence in any room. He shook Holmes's hand with enthusiasm and mine with warmth, and offered twice in the space of 5 minutes that the whole business was a terrible shock, and that Sir Malcolm had, of course, been a man of weakened heart for some years. I noted the repetition. Mr. Julian Pike was younger than the others by a considerable margin, somewhere in his middle 30s, lean and fine-featured with an air of studied carelessness that did not quite conceal the watchfulness beneath it. He was, Ainsworth had told us, a barrister himself, though one whose practice had of late been less active than his tastes apparently required, a circumstance which Sir Malcolm's estate would, by all accounts, do a good deal to remedy. He offered Holmes a pleasant nod, and immediately turned to examine the view from the window, a manoeuvre that struck me as rather too smooth. Miss Clara Whitmore was Sir Malcolm's private secretary, a composed woman of 40 with the precise, unhurried manner of one who has spent years managing the particulars of other people's affairs and found in that occupation both purpose and protection. She sat nearest the writing table, as if by long habit, and met Holmes's glance directly when he was introduced, which most of the others had not. Colonel Adrian March completed the assembly. He was a straight-backed man of 65 with close-cropped grey hair and the sort of face that outdoor soldiering produces. Tanned, angular, weathered into something harder than its original material. He stood rather than sat, positioned near the fireplace with his hands behind his back, and when Ainsworth mentioned Holmes's name he said, "The detective fellow?" in a tone that contrived to make the word detective suggest a mildly distasteful trade. Holmes received the remark with perfect serenity. "Just so, Colonel," he said pleasantly and passed on. For the better part of an hour, Holmes did very little that could have been called investigation by anyone observing from without. He accepted tea. He spoke to Mrs. Beresford about the garden, which was evidently her pride. He drew Dr. Halcombe into an easy conversation about the particular challenges of rural practice. He allowed Julian Pike to explain, with some elaboration, the complexities of estate succession law, listening with every appearance of an interested student. He asked Miss Whitmore how long she'd been in Sir Malcolm's employ, and received the answer 11 years with the quiet appreciation of a man to whom the figure meant something, though he did not say what. With Colonel March, he was briefer. He remarked upon a campaign medal visible on the mantelpiece and asked after the regiment. The Colonel answered precisely and without warmth, and Holmes thanked him and turned away. It was during this interval of apparent sociability that I attempted to observe what Holmes was actually attending to. I had some practice at this. He was watching hands. He was watching where each person's gaze moved when the name Kellard was introduced, which he managed twice in passing conversation, both times attributing the mention to Ainsworth's briefing notes as though it were merely procedural. On the first occasion, Dr. Halcombe's cup descended to its saucer a half-second too firmly. On the second, Colonel March turned to look into the fire with an abruptness that was not accounted for by anything the fire was doing. Mrs. Beresford alone did not react to the name at all, and it was the completeness of her stillness that struck me as, in its own way, the most deliberate response of all. Here, Holmes excused us from the company shortly afterward, and was at last admitted to the study by Ainsworth. It was a well-appointed room of the old sort, oak-panelled, lined with law reports and county histories, smelling of pipe tobacco and beeswax, and faintly of something burned. The desk was large and orderly, or had been. The surface was now occupied by the surviving inquest documents, laid out by Ainsworth's instruction, exactly as they had been found. Holmes stood over them for a long moment without touching anything. Then he took his lens from his breast pocket and bent low over the pages. I did not speak. The clock on the mantelpiece measured out 2 full minutes of silence. 2 hands, Holmes said at last, straightening. The original alterations and the later ones are by different people, Watson. And one writes with legal training and considerable nerve. The other writes with personal knowledge and, I think, personal sorrow. He set down the lens. And one of the people in that drawing-room has been in this room since Sir Malcolm died and believes, quite incorrectly, that they have left no trace of it. He glanced once at the cold fireplace, where a curl of blackened paper still clung to the grate, and then toward the window, beyond which the garden lay quiet in the grey afternoon light. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall begin with the physician, Chapter 3. The sudden death of a magistrate." We took rooms that night at the King's Head in Thurlow Cross, a comfortable enough inn whose landlord had the excellent quality of providing a good supper without requiring conversation. Holmes ate little and said less, and retired early, which in my experience signified not fatigue but the particular inward industriousness that precedes a day of active inquiry. I slept soundly, and woke to find a note beneath my door informing me that Holmes had already breakfasted and would meet me at Beresford House at 9. He was standing in the lane outside the gates when my cab arrived, his collar turned up against a sharp morning mist, examining with apparent interest the gravel of the drive where it met the public road. He looked up at my approach with the expression of a man who has already added something to his account. "The gravel was raked yesterday," he said, by way of greeting. "By the gardener, I should think, on instruction. Someone wished to be certain that any impressions made on the night of Sir Malcolm's death would be thoroughly erased. It is, when you consider it, a relatively crude precaution. It tells us the person responsible is careful but not experienced in these matters." "Could it not simply be the normal maintenance of the grounds?" I asked. "In April, in the early morning, following a bereavement, before the household is properly settled?" He glanced at me briefly. "Come, Watson, let us hear about the last evening of Sir Malcolm Beresford's life." It was Mrs. Beresford who received us, in the smaller sitting room off the entrance hall. In the morning light she appeared older than she had the previous afternoon, the composure intact, but costing more to maintain. She answered Holmes's questions with a precision that I thought spoke less of a retentive memory than of a narrative she'd quietly rehearsed. Sir Malcolm had dined at 7:30, she said, as was his custom. He had been quiet throughout the meal, not unpleasantly so, but preoccupied in the manner she had come to associate with his work. He had made no mention of the inquest papers directly, though she was aware he had been reviewing them for several days. After dinner he had declined company, asked that he not be disturbed, and retired to the study at approximately 9 o'clock. She had herself gone up at 10:30. The housemaid, a reliable young woman named Agnes, had discovered him at 6:30 the following morning, slumped forward at his desk, quite cold. Was the fire still alight when Agnes found him? Holmes asked. Mrs. Beresford considered. I believe it had burned quite low. She mentioned the room was cold. And the decanter on the desk. Was it his habit to take whisky while working? A brief pause. Occasionally. Not regularly. Thank you, Mrs. Beresford. I wonder if I might speak with Agnes. The housemaid was a steady, plain-spoken girl of perhaps 20, who gave her account with the literal accuracy of someone who has not yet learned to edit experience into narrative. The fire had been nearly out. The decanter was on the desk with a used glass beside it, barely touched. Sir Malcolm's pen was in his hand, or had been, having fallen to the floor. The papers were spread before him. She had not touched anything before raising the alarm, a fact she repeated with some emphasis, as though she had already been required to defend it. The pen, Holmes said. Which hand? Agnes blinked. His right hand, sir, or near enough. It was on the floor, just by his right side. And the papers? Were they in any kind of order? Stacked, or spread loosely? Spread out, sir, like he'd been reading across several at once. Holmes thanked her, and released her with a pleasantness that visibly surprised the girl, accustomed as she evidently was to being regarded as beneath the conversational threshold of professional men. He then asked to see Dr. Halcombe. The physician arrived with his morning affability fully restored, rubbing his hands together in the manner of a man perpetually cold, though the room was warm enough. He settled into his chair with the ease of one who has spent a lifetime making himself comfortable in other people's houses, and met Holmes's opening question, which concerned the precise circumstances of his examination of Sir Malcolm's body, with a fluency that was, I privately noted, almost too ready. The death, Halcombe said, Gaeldke, was entirely consistent with cardiac failure in a man of Sir Malcolm's age and history. He had treated him for a mitral irregularity for the better part of 6 years. The exertion of late-night mental labour, combined with the emotional strain of revisiting a difficult old case, was quite sufficient to account for the event. He had signed the certificate without hesitation, because hesitation would have been without foundation. Without any foundation at all, Holmes said pleasantly. None whatsoever. You examined him thoroughly, temperature of the body, condition of the lips, the eyes, as thoroughly as the circumstances required. A fraction of warmth had left the bonhomie, as though a lamp had been turned down by a careful hand. I have been a physician for 40 years, Mr. Holmes. Indeed, and Sir Malcolm's medication. He was taking something for the cardiac irregularity, I presume. Digitalis in a measured preparation, a standard treatment. Kept where? In the medicine cabinet in his study. He was conscientious about his doses. I see. Holmes rose pleasantly. You have been most helpful, Dr. Halcombe. I wonder if I might borrow you for one further moment this afternoon. There is a small point in the study I should like your professional opinion upon. Halcombe said he was entirely at Holmes's disposal, and his smile, when Holmes turned away, did not quite reach his eyes. We spent the better part of the following hour in the study. Holmes moved through it with a methodical patience that I had observed many times and never found less than instructive, working not from the obvious points outward but from the periphery inward, attending to the margins before the centre. He examined the window latch, the coal scuttle, the condition of the grate. He opened and closed the study door several times, listening to the latch. He spent a long while at the medicine cabinet, a small mahogany affair built into the alcove beside the fireplace, its key still in the lock. I watched him remove a small brown bottle, examine the label, and hold it to the light from the window. He said nothing. He replaced it with the same care with which he'd removed it, locked the cabinet and pocketed the key. Watson, he said, turning from the alcove, you are a medical man. If one wished to accelerate a cardiac event in a patient already taking digitalis, what would be the most undetectable means of doing so? I felt the question settle over the room with a particular weight. An increase in the dose, I said carefully. Digitalis in excess produces precisely the symptoms of severe cardiac failure. To a physician examining a patient already known to have a heart condition, the distinction would require considerable attention to identify. Considerable attention, and the will to find it. Holmes looked at the cabinet, neither of which was applied here. He crossed to the desk and stood where Sir Malcolm must have sat on the last night of his life, the papers before him, the lamp above, the quiet house around him. There was something in the stillness of his posture at that moment that I found unexpectedly affecting, an acknowledgment, perhaps, of the solitary courage it must have taken an old man to open documents he had closed 25 years before, and resolve at last to set things right. He knew what he was doing, Holmes said quietly, though whether he meant Sir Malcolm or someone else entirely he didn't clarify. He moved to the door. Come, I should like to speak with Miss Whitmore before luncheon, and this afternoon, Watson, I think we ought to have a closer look at the county records. He paused at the threshold and glanced back once at the medicine cabinet, its key now in his pocket and its secret, whatever it was, beginning, I felt certain, to run out of time. Chapter 4, The Altered Testimony. Miss Clara Whitmore received us in the small room adjoining the study that had served as her working quarters during her 11 years in Sir Malcolm's employ. It was a tidy, functional space, entirely without the personal accumulations one might expect of so long an occupation, and the tidiness itself struck me as characteristic of the woman. Her desk was cleared. The shelves behind her held ledgers and correspondence files, arranged with the quiet authority of someone who regards disorder as a form of disrespect. She'd been packing, she said, though without any haste, waiting to be told what was required of her before proceeding. Holmes settled into the chair she offered, and looked about the room with the easy interest of a man making a social call. You typed copies of the inquest documents for Sir Malcolm, he began. I believe Mr. Ainsworth mentioned the week before last. I did. 3 complete copies. Sir Malcolm wished to work from transcriptions and preserve the originals from handling. She folded her hands on the desk before her. I returned the originals to him on the Thursday. He thanked me and locked them in the cabinet himself. You read them naturally in the course of transcription. A brief consideration. I read them as one reads any document one is engaged to copy, with attention to accuracy rather than content. And yet their content must have impressed itself upon you even so. After 11 years, you would know Sir Malcolm's mind well enough to understand why those particular documents troubled him. Something shifted in her expression. Not evasion, but a careful weighing. He had not been easy on himself about that case for some time. He mentioned it once, perhaps 2 years ago, in a context I took to be personal rather than professional. He said that a magistrate's duty is to the truth of the evidence before him, and that the evidence before one is not always the whole of the truth. She paused. I understood him to mean that he had carried something. Indeed, Holmes's tone was entirely without pressure. The copies you made, Miss Whitmore, are they still in this room? One is. The other two I gave to Sir Malcolm with the originals. The third I kept as my own record of the work, as is my habit with all documents of legal significance. Holmes accepted the copy she retrieved from a lower drawer with the attentiveness of a man receiving something of considerable value. He laid it across his knee and spent several minutes moving through it while Miss Whitmore and I sat in a silence that she, at least, appeared entirely comfortable with. I watched Holmes's lens pass slowly down one page, then another. He paused twice. The second pause was longer than the first. This copy is faithful to the originals as they stood on the Thursday, he said at last, setting the lens aside. It was not a question. It is an exact transcription. Then the alterations to the originals occurred between the Thursday and the morning of Sir Malcolm's death. He looked up. Miss Whitmore, I want you to read this passage here, the account of the medical examiner's findings regarding the time of death, and tell me whether anything in the original document struck you as unusual when you transcribed it. She leaned forward and read in silence. Her expression did not change, but a small vertical line appeared between her brows. The phrasing here is imprecise, she said carefully. The original medical observation was more specific. I transcribed it exactly. But I recall thinking that for a coroner's record it was strangely worded. It assigned a range of 4 hours to the time of death where a more definite estimate might have been expected. A range that conveniently accommodated more than one version of the evening's events, Holmes said. In the surviving originals, that passage has been further softened. The range has been extended, and the reasoning behind it removed entirely. He turned a page. And here, the witness account of Mr. Thomas Kellard's departure from the dinner gathering. In your copy, it reads that Kellard left at approximately 9:30 in a state of some agitation following a disagreement. In the original as it now stands, the agitation has been removed and the time shifted to 10 o'clock. Miss Whitmore was quiet for a moment. That alteration changes the picture considerably. It provides 30 additional minutes in which the death could have been straightforwardly accidental, Holmes agreed, and removes the only documented evidence that Kellard left the gathering under circumstances of dispute. He closed the copy and returned it to her with both hands, a small formality that I thought she appreciated. You have been of very great assistance. One final matter. In your 11 years here, did you ever know Colonel March to visit the house? The line between her brows returned. He visited perhaps 3 or 4 times in total. The last occasion was some 18 months ago. He and Sir Malcolm spent an evening in the study, and I remember it because Sir Malcolm was subdued for several days afterward. There was no open unpleasantness, but something had passed between them that left its mark. Holmes thanked her, and we withdrew. In the entrance hall he handed me the folded copy he had made of 2 pages from Miss Whitmore's transcription before returning it, a fact I had observed without remarking upon, Holmes having long since cured me of surprise at the sleight of hand that accompanies his more industrious interviews. He indicated the passages he had marked. 2 alterations of legal significance, he said quietly, walking toward the front door, and both of a particular kind. They do not invent new facts, they remove existing ones. Whoever made these changes understood that fabrication is far more dangerous than erasure, that a court may challenge what has been added but seldom misses what is gone. You said yesterday there were 2 distinct hands in the alterations, I reminded him. I did. The erasures and the rewriting of the medical passage show one hand, practiced, deliberate, legally trained. The removal of the quarrel from the witness statement is different in character. The ink is slightly different, the pressure of the pen lighter, and the choice of what to remove is not tactical but protective. It is the work of someone who knew the names behind the facts and wished to shield them, not to obscure the mechanism of a crime but to soften its human consequences. He pushed open the door onto the pale afternoon. One person tried to bury the past more deeply. Another tried to make it a little less sharp. We walked in silence down the gravel path toward the lane where our cab waited. The mist of the morning had resolved itself into a thin, even light that flattened the shadows of the copper beeches and made the grounds look faintly unreal, like a landscape recalled rather than observed. "Holmes," I said, "the witness statement. The quarrel Kellard had at dinner before his death. With whom was he quarrelling?" "That," Holmes said, "is the question upon which everything else depends. The answer is not in those papers. It is in the memory of one or more of the people in that house, and at least one of them has known it for 25 years. He glanced back once at Beresford House, its windows blank and pale against the sky. "This afternoon we go to the County Records Office in Guildford. I want the original depositions filed at the time of the inquest, the ones that were never recalled for Sir Malcolm's review, and I want the name of every individual who gave testimony." He climbed into the cab and settled back with his eyes half closed, and I recognised the signs of a mind that had reached a junction and was deciding with characteristic certainty which road to take. "The quarrel," I said again, taking my seat opposite. "Kellard was a factory owner who had discovered a fraud," Holmes said, without opening his eyes. "Fraud requires a perpetrator with both access and motive. We know who had access to the mill accounts. What we do not yet know, but shall, is which man at that dinner table stood to lose the most if Kellard spoke." A brief pause. "Though I confess, Watson, the outline is becoming tolerably clear." He said nothing further until Guildford. Chapter 5. The Drowned Man of Larkspur Mill. The records office in Guildford occupied the ground floor of a civic building that smelled of damp stone and the particular staleness of paper that has not been disturbed in a great while, a smell I have always associated with the patience of official institutions, their vast indifference to urgency. A clerk of middle years received us with the mild suspicion of a man whose professional life has taught him that no one arrives in search of old documents without a reason they would prefer not to explain in full. Holmes was charm itself, producing a letter from Ainsworth that described our purpose in the most anodyne terms available to legal language, and within 20 minutes we were seated at a long table beneath a high window, with the original deposition file of the Kellard inquest open before us. It was thinner than I had expected. An inquest of some local controversy, conducted by a sitting magistrate over a death that had divided opinion in the district, might reasonably have accumulated a substantial record. What lay before us was spare to the point of suggesting deliberate economy. Holmes read without comment for some time. I read beside him, and what I found was a document that conveyed, in the aggregate, the impression of an event that had been shaped rather than recorded. The individual elements were all present and in their proper places. The sequence of the evening was established. The witnesses had been called. The verdict had been reached. Yet the whole read less like an account of an investigation than like a transcript of a conclusion that had already been agreed upon, the form of inquiry preserved while its substance was quietly set aside. There were 4 principal depositions. Colonel March had testified that Kellard left the dinner gathering at the Larkspur Mill House at 10 o'clock in good spirits, bound for home on foot by the riverside path, as was his habit. Dr. Halcombe had given evidence that the body, recovered from the river at first light, bore no injuries inconsistent with a fall from the bank in darkness, and that death by drowning was the clear medical conclusion. A mill foreman named Jessup had stated that the riverbank path was known to be uneven at that season, particularly after recent rain. Sir Malcolm presiding, had directed the jury with a measured firmness toward a verdict of accidental death. No mention of a quarrel, I observed. None, and observe who is absent from the depositions entirely. Holmes turned the file toward me and indicated the list of those present at the dinner. 7 names. Of those 7, 4 had given evidence. The remaining 3 were listed only as attendees and had not been called. One of those 3 names was Mrs. Eleanor Beresford, recorded then as Miss Eleanor Carver, described in a marginal notation as a family acquaintance of the Kellards. Holmes sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of a man confirming a calculation he has already performed in his head. "She was there," I said. "She was there, as a young woman, perhaps 30 years of age, acquainted with the Kellard family. present at the dinner on the evening Thomas Kellard died, and never called to give evidence at the inquest presided over by the man she would subsequently marry. He paused. Sir Malcolm suppressed her testimony, Watson, or rather, he ensured it was never required. Whether to protect her or to protect the verdict or both, I cannot yet say with certainty. I looked again at the deposition file, at the neat closed shape of it, and thought of Sir Malcolm in his study 25 years later, working by lamplight through those same pages, carrying what he had carried the whole long interval of his marriage and his reputation. Holmes had meanwhile turned to a second folder that the clerk had produced at his request, this one containing the supplementary materials filed at the time, letters, reports, and correspondence relating to the inquest proceedings. Most of it was administrative. Near the bottom, however, Holmes extracted a single sheet, handwritten, apparently a private note from the county coroner to Sir Malcolm, dated 3 days after the verdict. He read it twice, folded it with care, and looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as the particular gravity of a man who has found what he expected, and is not pleased to have been right. The coroner had reservations, Holmes said. He writes here to advise Sir Malcolm that one witness, not called at the inquest, had approached him privately following the verdict. This witness claimed to have observed an altercation on the riverbank path on the night in question, between Kellard and another man. The coroner notes that he investigated the claim informally and found it, and here he uses an interesting word, premature to act upon. The file was closed. The witness is not named. Could it have been Mrs. Beresford? Miss Carver, as she was then? Almost certainly. The coroner's reluctance to name her, his choice of the word premature rather than unfounded, his private correspondence with the presiding magistrate rather than any official notation, all of it suggests that what he had was not evidence he could dismiss, but evidence he preferred not to pursue. Holmes replaced the sheet in its folder. She saw something on that bank. Sir Malcolm knew she had seen it. And 25 years later, when he finally resolved to open the matter again, she was still in that house with him. We returned the files to the clerk and walked out into the afternoon, which had grown cooler, a wind coming in off the downs carrying the smell of rain not yet fallen. I turned the matter over as we walked, attempting to arrange what we had into a coherent shape. Kellard accused someone at that dinner of fraud, I said. March, by the outline of things. The accusation led to a confrontation on the riverbank path. Mrs. Beresford witnessed some part of it. Kellard died. The inquest was guided to a comfortable verdict by Sir Malcolm, who may or may not have known the full truth at the time, but who had reasons of his own to ensure that the witness he silenced would not afterwards be in a position to contradict him. He married her, Holmes said quietly. Yes. Whether that was a transaction or a genuine attachment I cannot say, and it does not alter the mechanism of what occurred. What it does tell us is that Sir Malcolm and Eleanor Carver shared a secret from the very beginning of their life together, and that the burden of it grew, as such burdens do, heavier with time rather than lighter. We reached the cab stand and Holmes gave the direction of Thurlow Cross. As we drove, the first spots of rain began to strike the window in a desultory, uncommitted fashion, as though the weather too could not quite decide what it intended. March, I said. He knew Kellard had found evidence of fraud. He confronted him, or was confronted. There was a struggle. The fraud concerned military supply contracts, Holmes said. I found a passing reference in the mill account summary attached to the inquest file, a notation regarding discrepancies in material orders between the mill and a third-party supplier. The notation was marked resolved, but with no further explanation. Military supply contracts in that period were a considerable source of private profit for those with the right connections and insufficient scruple. He looked out at the wet road. Kellard had the evidence and made the mistake of confronting March before he had secured it beyond March's reach. And Halcombe was present. Halcombe was present, and a young physician building a rural practice cannot afford to have witnessed a gentleman's violent act and done nothing. His silence was purchased by necessity as much as complicity. Holmes drew his coat closer. 3 men preserved one another across a quarter century, and one old magistrate in the last months of his life decided the arrangement had endured long enough. The rain settled into earnest as we came into Thurlow Cross. Holmes said nothing further that evening on the subject, but I noticed when we stopped at the inn that he sat for a long while by the window in the public room, his pipe unlit in his hand, watching the rain move in curtains across the village street with the expression of a man who has found the shape of a thing and is now concerned, most carefully, with the weight of it. Chapter 6. The Pattern of Silence. The rain had not relented by morning, and Holmes was at the breakfast table when I came down, a pot of strong tea at his elbow and 3 sheets of closely written notes spread before him, in the arrangement I recognised as his working map, not a narrative of events, but a diagram of their logical dependencies, each established fact connected to its implications by a line of reasoning he had satisfied himself was sound. He did not look up when I sat down, but he poured my tea with the absent accuracy of long habit. "I have been reconstructing the evening," he said, without preamble. The evening of the 23rd of October, 1870, the dinner at Larkspur Mill House, Kellard's accusation, the sequence of what followed. I helped myself to toast and waited. Kellard had been gathering evidence of the fraud for some weeks, possibly longer. He was a methodical man, by all accounts. A self-made owner who had built the mill from a modest inheritance and understood accounts as a tradesman understands his stock. When he identified the discrepancy in the military supply contracts, he would not have acted impulsively. He would have confirmed it, documented it, and chosen his moment. Holmes set down his pen. He chose badly. He chose a social occasion, a dinner at his own table, where March was a guest, and he made the accusation in company. "Why in company?" I asked. "Surely a private confrontation would have been safer." He may have believed that witnesses provided protection, that March would not dare to respond with violence in a room full of people. Holmes's mouth set briefly. He was wrong on both counts. The accusation was made. March denied it. The exchange grew heated. At some point in the evening, Kellard took himself out of the room, either from anger or with the intention of recovering his composure before matters went further. March followed him. And Halcombe followed March, whether from loyalty, anxiety, or the instinct of a man who suspects that a situation is deteriorating and wishes to be present when it does, I cannot say with precision. What I can say is that when Kellard reached the riverbank path, he was not alone. I thought of the coroner's letter, the unnamed witness who had approached him after the verdict, a young woman at the dinner, an acquaintance of the family, standing perhaps at an upstairs window or stepping out onto the grounds for air, and seeing in the darkness below 3 figures on the path beside the water. There was a struggle, Holmes continued, his voice even and dispassionate. Kellard was struck, or pushed, with sufficient force to send him into the river. The bank at that point, as the mill foreman Jessup usefully testified, was uneven and in poor condition after rain, a fact that had been prepared in advance as an explanation, or was seized upon afterward as a convenient one. Either is possible. What is not possible is that Kellard's entry into that water was accidental. He gathered his notes into a neat stack and turned his cup in his saucer with a thoughtful rotation. March, Halcombe, and Sir Malcolm returned to the house. Whether Sir Malcolm was present on the bank or learned of what had occurred only after the fact is a distinction that matters morally but not legally. He presided over the inquest. He directed its conclusion. He ensured that Eleanor Carver was not called to give evidence. And he subsequently married her, a union that completed the architecture of silence with admirable thoroughness. Every person who knew the truth in full was thereafter bound to every other person who knew it. A conspiracy of 3, I said, with a 4th witness whose evidence was the one loose thread. Precisely. And loose threads, Watson, have a way of pulling at the fabric of a life until the owner of that life cannot bear the sensation any longer. He rose from the table and moved to the window looking out at the rain-soaked lane. Sir Malcolm bore it for 25 years. He rose in reputation, married well, administered justice in his county, with by all accounts genuine conscientiousness. There is a particular species of guilt that attaches itself to a man who continues to do good works, in the knowledge that the foundation of his standing is a suppressed truth. It does not diminish with good conduct, it accumulates. I considered this. It had the ring not merely of deductive analysis, but of something more closely observed, though Holmes gave no further indication of it. His decision to reopen the matter, I said. What prompted it, do you think, at this late stage? Age, in part. The knowledge that the documents would outlive him, and that their eventual discovery, in their unaltered state, would expose the whole fabric long after he was beyond accountability. But I think there was something else. Holmes turned from the window. Miss Whitmore told us he had not been easy in himself about the case for some time. She recalled a remark of his from 2 years ago about a magistrate's duty to the truth of the evidence before him. I believe that was the beginning of a resolution he had been constructing for 2 years before he acted upon it. Then the timing of his death is not coincidental. It is profoundly not coincidental. Halcombe had been his physician for 6 years. He knew the state of Sir Malcolm's heart, the dosage of his medication, the conditions under which a cardiac event could be induced without arousing suspicion. When Sir Malcolm retrieved those documents from the archives and began his review, word reached Halcombe, and Halcombe understood what it meant. Not merely exposure of the original fraud and the manipulation of the inquest, but the specific falsification of his own medical evidence, the death certificate he signed. The post-mortem observations he shaped toward accident. Holmes's voice remained level, but there was a quality of contained precision in it that I recognised as the nearest he came to anger. He had the most to lose professionally. A fraudulent inquest verdict might be explained as the error of a young physician under social pressure. A deliberately falsified medical report produced to conceal a violent death is a matter of an entirely different character before any medical tribunal, so he adjusted the medication. A fractional increase in the digitalis preparation, enough to ensure that a man already carrying a cardiac irregularity would not survive a long night of mental and emotional strain. Enough to remain invisible to a physician examining a patient already known to have a weakened heart. Provided the physician was not looking for it, he paused. Provided also that the examining physician was the man who had made the adjustment. The rain struck the window in a gust and subsided. Outside, the lane was empty, the copper beaches dark and heavy with water. The alteration to the documents, I said. That was not Halcombe. No, Halcombe needed Sir Malcolm dead and the matter closed. He had no reason to tamper with documents that were already secured and would, with Sir Malcolm's death, simply return to obscurity. The person who entered that study and altered those papers had a different purpose entirely, and operated, I believe, in the hours after Sir Malcolm's death was discovered, before Ainsworth arrived, before any inventory of the study's contents was formally taken. He crossed to the door and took his coat from the hook beside it. "This morning," he said, pulling it on, "I wish to speak with Colonel March, not in the drawing-room and not with the others present. I shall ask Ainsworth to arrange it, and I shall ask him also to ensure that Mrs. Beresford is otherwise engaged." He buttoned his coat with deliberate attention. March has maintained his silence for 25 years without apparent difficulty. But he is a soldier, Watson, and a soldier's particular vulnerability is this. He has been trained to hold a position, but not to hold it indefinitely against an enemy who has already taken the ground around him. He opened the door onto the wet morning. "Come, I think the Colonel will find, this time, that the position is no longer worth defending." Chapter 7. The Convenient Heir. Holmes had arranged through Ainsworth that Colonel March should receive us in the billiard-room, a choice of location that struck me at first as arbitrary, until I reflected that it was the one room in the house that adjoined neither the study nor the drawing-room, and that offered, through its long windows, a clear view of anyone approaching across the gravel. Holmes preferred, when interviewing a man he expected to resist, to have no audience and no means of rapid appeal to others. The Colonel was already there when we arrived, standing at the far window with his hands behind his back, in the posture he seemed to inhabit as a default, a man who had spent so many years at attention that repose had become a foreign country. He turned when we entered and regarded Holmes with an expression from which social courtesy had been almost entirely withdrawn, leaving only the bare minimum required for civilized exchange. "I have already told Ainsworth everything I know about Malcolm's death," he said before Holmes could speak, "which is nothing beyond the obvious. He was an old man with a poor heart who worked too late into the night. I am not sure what you expect to add to that." "Nor am I as yet," Holmes said pleasantly, settling himself uninvited into one of the leather chairs beside the billiard table. "I was hoping you might help me understand something about the period 25 years ago, the Kellard inquest. I believe you gave testimony." The pause that followed was measured in fractions, but I caught it. I did, as did others. The matter was concluded to the satisfaction of the court. "Quite so. You testified that Kellard left the dinner at 10 o'clock in good spirits." Holmes regarded him with mild interest. "I have before me a transcription of the original inquest documents, prepared last week by Sir Malcolm's secretary, from papers that had not been altered at the time of her transcription, in which your testimony places the departure at 9:30, and notes that Kellard was in a state of some agitation, a discrepancy of 30 minutes, and a material difference in the characterization of his condition." March said nothing. He had turned from the window and now stood facing Holmes with his jaw set, and I was reminded, watching him, of a man on a parade ground being dressed by a superior officer and enduring it by force of discipline alone. "The alteration to your testimony in the original record was made after Sir Malcolm's death," Holmes continued. "You did not make it. Someone else did, and did so on your behalf, or what they conceived to be your behalf. That is, I should think, a complicating circumstance for which you were not prepared." "I don't know what you're suggesting." "I am suggesting very little at present. I am observing that the discrepancy exists, that it is significant, and that you are the only person in this house who can account for it from personal knowledge." Holmes folded his hands. "Colonel March, I have not come here this morning to extract a confession. I have come because I believe you are in possession of facts that are material to a far more immediate matter than the death of Thomas Kellard. And I believe you are intelligent enough to understand that your continued silence on those facts will serve you considerably less well than you may imagine." Something altered in March's expression, a controlled shift, like a door opened briefly and then firmly closed again. He moved from the window and sat down, not in the chair nearest Holmes, but in the one at the farthest point of the table, as though distance were the last negotiating position available to him. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Did you follow Kellard to the riverbank path on the night he died?" A long silence. The rain continued against the windows. "Yes," March said. "Was Dr. Halcombe with you?" "He followed. I did not ask him to." "And the confrontation. Kellard had accused you at dinner of fraud in connection with the military supply contracts." The accusation was accurate. It was not phrased as a question. March received it as one. "The accounts were irregular. Kellard had misunderstood the arrangements." "A misunderstanding that you pursued him to a riverbank in darkness at 9:30 at night to clarify," Holmes said, with no particular inflection. March's jaw tightened. There was a struggle. "He struck me first. I pushed him away and he lost his footing on the bank." He said it with the flat economy of a man delivering a report he has composed many times over many years and would like at last to be done with. "I did not intend what happened. I reached for him. Halcombe reached for him. The current took him before either of us could hold him. The room was quiet. I found I had nothing to say and was grateful that Holmes did not look at me." "Sir Malcolm," Holmes said. "He was not on the bank." "He came out of the house 5 minutes afterward. We told him what had occurred. He understood the implications and he made a decision." March's voice had flattened further, stripped down to something that was neither remorse nor defiance, but a kind of exhausted factuality. "I'm not asking you to think well of any of it. I am telling you what happened. "I appreciate the distinction," Holmes said. "One further matter. On the night of Sir Malcolm's death, did you enter the study?" March looked at him steadily. "No." "You were in the house that evening?" "I had dinner here and departed at 9. I did not return. Whatever happened in that study had nothing to do with me." A pause, and then with a narrowed focus. "What did happen in that study, mister?" "Holmes?" Holmes rose without answering and thanked the Colonel in the pleasant, unrevealing tone he reserved for interviews that had yielded precisely what he sought. We left March sitting at the billiard table in the grey morning light, a man in the odd position of having just confessed to one serious matter as a means of establishing his innocence in another. In the corridor, I fell into step beside Holmes. "You believe him?" I said. "About the study?" "I do. He has carried the account of that river bank for 25 years with the rigidity of a man who cannot afford to let it shift even slightly. He told me the truth about Kellard because the truth about that night no longer poses him the greatest danger." Holmes moved toward the staircase. "Ainsworth is in the library. I want a word with him about Julian Pike." Pike, Lee Ainsworth confirmed when we found him, had indeed visited the house on the night of Sir Malcolm's death. A housemaid had observed him in the entrance hall at approximately 10 o'clock, and he had explained his presence afterward as a spontaneous call to discuss estate matters, a claim that Ainsworth had accepted with less than complete conviction. Pike's debts were substantial. His practice had generated little income for 2 years. The inheritance would resolve both conditions entirely. Holmes listened to this with the expression of a man being offered a meal he has already decided not to eat. "The case against Pike is admirably tidy," he said, when Ainsworth had finished. "Motive, opportunity, sufficient legal knowledge to make the alterations, and a convenient argument with Sir Malcolm earlier in the day to establish animus." He moved to the library window. "Inspector Lestrade, I imagine, would find it entirely satisfactory." "You do not?" Ainsworth asked. "I find it too satisfactory. The alterations to those documents are not the work of a man in financial desperation trying to hasten an inheritance. They are the work of someone who read those papers with careful attention, understood precisely what each passage meant, and chose with deliberate selectivity what to remove and what to leave." Holmes turned from the window. "Pike would have destroyed the documents entirely or taken them. Someone else needed them to survive, but in a form that protected specific people." He paused. "Not to bury the past. To make it, as I said to you yesterday, Watson, a little less sharp." He said it half to himself, looking at nothing in particular, and I recognised in his tone the quality of a man standing at the final door before the answer, his hand already on the latch. Chapter 8. The Physician's Certainty. It was after luncheon, which Holmes declined, and I ate alone in the smaller dining room with the company of my own thoughts, that he came to find me with the particular directness of a man who has spent the intervening hour in productive solitude and is ready to move. "I require Dr. Halcombe," he said from the doorway, "and I require the medicine cabinet, and I should like you present in your professional capacity rather than your chronicling one. What I am about to demonstrate is a medical matter before it is a legal one, and your opinion will carry a weight that mine cannot." We found Halcombe in the drawing-room, reading a medical journal with the studied ease of a man who was not reading it at all. He set it down when we entered, and rose with his customary affability, though I thought the affability had grown somewhat effortful over the course of our visit, like a fire maintained past the natural hour of its burning. Holmes explained that he had 1 or 2 small points remaining in the study, and would be grateful for the doctor's assistance. Halcombe agreed with a readiness that was slightly too prompt, the readiness of a man who prefers to know what is happening in a room rather than wait outside it. The study was as we had left it, the surviving inquest documents on the desk, the cold fireplace to one side, the medicine cabinet in its alcove. Holmes crossed directly to the cabinet and produced from his pocket the key he had removed 2 days before. Halcombe observed this without apparent surprise, though a stillness came over him that had not been there in the doorway. Holmes unlocked the cabinet. It held a modest dispensary of the kind common to a country household of means, a bottle of compound tincture for digestive complaints, a preparation for headache, bandaging materials, a small bottle of chloral in a clearly labelled measure, and on the right-hand shelf, slightly forward of the others, a brown glass bottle of digitalis solution, its label in the neat manuscript of a dispensing chemist. Holmes lifted it and held it toward the window. He did not yet speak. He turned the bottle once in his fingers, and then set it on the desk beside the inquest papers and looked at Halcombe. "Watson," he said, "you have prescribed digitalis in your practice." "On a number of occasions," I said. "In cardiac cases, yes." For a patient with a mitral irregularity of moderate severity, of Sir Malcolm's age and general constitution, what would constitute a safe maintenance dose? I looked at the bottle. The label indicated a concentration I had used myself in practice, and against it a dosage instruction in what I took to be Halcombe's handwriting. I named a figure. And a dose sufficient to induce, over several hours of physical and emotional exertion, a cardiac event of fatal severity in such a patient. I named a second figure. It was appreciably higher than the first. Not dramatically so, not the reckless excess of ignorance or rage, but the precise calibrated increment of someone who understood exactly where the margin lay and had moved just beyond it. I looked at the label again. The dosage written there was the second figure. The silence in the room had a specific quality. Halcombe stood very still near the door, his medical journal still in one hand, and his face had undergone a change that I found, from a purely clinical perspective, instructive. It was not the blanching of shock nor the flush of guilt suddenly discovered. It was something more considered, the expression of a man who has known for some days that this moment was approaching and has spent that interval deciding how to meet it. "That is my handwriting," he said at last, "and it is not the dosage I prescribed." "No," Holmes agreed, "it is not. The original instruction, which I was able to read beneath the current notation by the application of oblique light and a reasonably powerful lens, specified the lower figure that Dr. Watson has just given us. The overwriting is recent, accomplished with a slightly different pen and the same ink as the alteration to the medical passage in the inquest documents." He paused. "You adjusted the label after you had adjusted the preparation itself, a precaution in case the bottle was examined and the concentration measured against the instruction." Halcombe set down the journal. The gesture was slow and deliberate, the movement of a man buying himself a few additional seconds in which to decide whether the position he has held for 40 professional years is worth one further effort at defence. He appeared to conclude that it was not. "He was going to destroy us all," he said. The bluntness of it was almost startling after the careful social tone of the preceding days. Everything we had built, March myself, the reputations of our families, everything, for the sake of a dead man who's been in his grave for 25 years and cannot be restored by any document Sir Malcolm might have lodged with any court in England. "He could be restored to his proper verdict," Holmes said, "which is, I imagine, precisely what Sir Malcolm intended. A verdict that would have named me as the physician who falsified the medical report. Not a young man under social pressure, not an error of judgment, but deliberate falsification in the service of concealing a violent death." His voice had acquired a flatness that was not quite cold and not quite reasonable, but something between the two that I found more troubling than either. "I had one consideration, Mr. Holmes. My granddaughters are at school. My son holds a position at a teaching hospital in Edinburgh. I am not a young man protecting a career. I am an old man protecting people who had nothing to do with any of it, and would be destroyed by association with it." Holmes looked at him for a long moment. "That may be true," he said. "It does not alter what you did." Halcombe made no reply. "I want to be precise about one thing," Holmes continued, moving to the desk and standing with his hand resting lightly on the bottle. "The alteration to the inquest documents, the erasures, the rewriting of your medical observations, that was not your work." Halcombe's eyes moved fractionally toward the door, a reflex immediately controlled. No. "You discovered it when you came to the study after Sir Malcolm's body was found. The papers had already been interfered with before you arrived." a pause that was itself a kind of answer. "I found them in that condition, yes." "And you said nothing, because their alteration, whatever its motive, served your interest well enough that disclosure would have been irrational." Holmes straightened. "Which tells me that you know, or suspect, who made those alterations, and that you have chosen silence on that matter with the same calculation you have applied to everything else." Halcombe looked out of the window at the garden, at the copper beeches and the pale sky above them, and his expression settled into something that I can only describe as the specific sorrow of a man surveying the full extent of a landscape he's been avoiding for a very long time. "What happens now?" he said. "Now," Holmes said, restoring the bottle to the cabinet with the precise care of a man handling evidence. "I send a telegram to Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who will arrive tomorrow and to whom you will give a full account. I would recommend in the interim that you do not leave the house." He locked the cabinet and pocketed the key again. At the door he paused and turned back, and there was in his expression not the satisfaction of conclusion, but the more complicated quality of a man who has found what he was looking for and takes no pleasure in it. "For what it may be worth, Dr. Halcombe," he said quietly, "I do not doubt that your concern for your family is genuine. A great deal of genuine concern in this case has produced a great deal of harm. That is perhaps the most instructive fact in it." He held the door for me and we went out into the corridor, leaving Halcombe standing alone in the study amid the papers and the cold grate and the accumulated weight of a silence that had, at last, run its full course. Chapter 9. The Weight of the Past. Inspector Lestrade arrived on the 11 o'clock train from Waterloo, accompanied by a constable and the particular expression he reserved for cases in which Sherlock Holmes had preceded him, a compound of professional wariness and the reluctant acknowledgement that the ground had almost certainly been worked more thoroughly than anything he himself might have managed. He shook Holmes's hand in the entrance hall of Beresford House with the brisk cordiality of a man determined to take possession of events before they moved further without him. "Your telegram was brief," he said, with a note of mild reproach. "The essential facts are straightforward," Holmes replied. "I have prepared a written summary for you. What remains to be done this morning is not a matter of detection but of witness. I should be grateful if you would stay your questions till I have assembled the household, and then ask whatever you find necessary afterward." Lestrade received this arrangement with the expression of a man agreeing to a game whose rules, he suspects, are not entirely to his advantage, but agreeing none the less because experience had taught him that the alternative was worse. The household was gathered in the drawing-room within the half-hour. They came in the careful, separate fashion of people who have spent several days in close proximity without speaking freely to one another, and the room arranged itself, as rooms do on such occasions, into a map of its own tensions. Halcombe sat near the window, removed from the others by a margin that was slightly too large to be accidental. Colonel March stood at the fireplace. Julian Pike had chosen a chair near the door with the self-conscious casualness of a man who wishes to suggest that departure is not something he has considered. Miss Whitmore sat at the writing-table, her hands in her lap. Ainsworth stood near Lestrade, who had positioned himself with his constable to one side of the doorway. Mrs. Eleanor Beresford sat in the armchair nearest the fire, of erect and still, and her eyes, when Holmes entered, went to him with a directness that suggested she had been waiting for this moment for some days, and had decided how she would meet it. Holmes stood before the assembled company without theatricality, without the self-conscious deliberation that such occasions sometimes produce in lesser investigators. He spoke clearly and at a measured pace, as though delivering a legal summation to parties who were entitled to follow every step of the reasoning. He began not with Sir Malcolm's death, but with Thomas Kellard's. He described the dinner of October the 23rd, 1870, the accusation of fraud, the confrontation on the riverbank, and the death that followed. He named no action of Colonel March's that March himself had not already confirmed, and the Colonel, to his credit, stood throughout without interruption, his face set in the expression of a man enduring a necessary process with the last discipline available to him. He described the inquest and its management, the suppression of the witness who had approached the coroner afterward, and the architecture of silence that had held across a quarter century. He said all of this without editorializing, without the punctuation of moral condemnation, in the tone of a man laying out the components of a mechanism so that it may be clearly understood by those who have not previously seen it whole. Then he spoke of Sir Malcolm. He described the retrieval of the documents from the county archives, the long-delayed resolution of a conscience that had been carrying its burden since the morning. A young magistrate decided that the truth before him was one he could not afford to deliver. He described the final evening, the lamp on the desk, the papers spread for review, and the careful, invisible adjustment to a medicine bottle that had ensured the magistrate would not reach morning. Here Lestrade stirred, and Holmes raised a hand briefly, and Lestrade subsided. "Dr. Halcombe," Holmes said, "has been made aware of the evidence against him, and will give a full account to Inspector Lestrade this afternoon. I will say only this much now. The motive was the preservation of a professional reputation, and the means were those available to a physician of long experience and detailed knowledge of his patient's condition. They were not the means of a violent man, but of a frightened one, and that distinction, while it does not mitigate the act, belongs to any complete account of it." He paused. The room was entirely still. "There remains one matter," Holmes said, "which is distinct in character from everything I have described, and which requires a different kind of consideration." He turned, with a naturalness that was itself the product of careful preparation, toward Mrs. Beresford. She did not flinch. She met his gaze with the composure of a woman who has been waiting for a specific sentence for several days and has made her arrangements accordingly. "You were at the dinner on the night Thomas Keller died," Holmes said. "You were, I believe, on the grounds of Larkspur Mill House when the confrontation occurred on the bank. You saw enough to have given material evidence at the inquest and were not called to do so. 25 years later, when your husband retrieved the documents that he intended to correct before his death, you read them." "He showed them to me," Mrs. Beresford said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. 3 weeks before he died. He told me what he intended to do." A breath ran through the room, almost imperceptible. "You asked him not to proceed," Holmes said. "I asked him to consider what it would mean for the families of the men involved. Edwin Halcombe's grandchildren. The regiment March has been associated with for 40 years. The reputations of people who had done nothing except be born to the wrong fathers." She looked at Holmes without appeal, without the expectation of agreement. Yea, in the manner of someone presenting a position they hold to be defensible and are prepared to defend. Sir Malcolm would not be dissuaded. He was, in his quiet way, a very determined man. "So you came to the study after he was found? In the early hours of the morning, before the household was fully roused. You had a key?" "I have always had a key." A pause. "I did not know, then, what Edwin had done. I believed my husband had died of his heart, as Edwin told us all he would eventually, and I thought that the documents he had spent his last night reviewing would be found and submitted, and the consequences would fall upon people who could not be protected from them." She folded her hands in her lap with the deliberateness I had noted on the first afternoon. "I removed what I could remove without making the alteration obvious. I did not fabricate. I did not invent. I took out the names, the specific accusations, the passages that pointed most directly to individuals still living." She looked at Holmes with something that was almost, but not quite, a challenge. "I left enough of the truth that anyone with sufficient intelligence and persistence could reconstruct the whole." A silence of several seconds. "You left enough," Holmes said, "because you did not wish to bury the truth entirely, only to soften it." "Thomas Keller has been dead for 25 years, she said. "Nothing I could do or leave undone would restore him. What I could do was ensure that the living were not destroyed for the sins of the men they happened to be attached to. And your husband's intention to correct the record, you set that aside." For the first time, and something crossed her face that was not composure, not grief, precisely, but the particular expression of a woman who has made a decision she does not entirely forgive herself for, and has decided to carry it as she has carried everything else. "My husband was dying," she said. Edwin Halcombe had seen to that, though I did not know it then. Whatever Malcolm had intended died with him. I told myself it was over. She looked at her hands. It was not over. Lestrade stepped forward. Holmes moved aside and the inspector began his work, and I stood near the door in the careful stillness of a man who has watched a long mechanism reach its final position and finds, now that it has, that the dominant sensation is not satisfaction, but something considerably quieter and more difficult to name. Chapter 10. The Memory of Water. The afternoon that followed Lestrade's arrival was occupied with the necessary formalities of a process that, once set in motion, proceeds by its own momentum with little need of further direction. Halcombe gave his account in the study with Lestrade and his constable, and I was asked to remain present, both as a medical witness to the technical particulars, and because Lestrade, whatever his reservations about Holmes's methods, had learned over the years that a record kept by Watson was a record that would be found to be accurate when accuracy was subsequently required. Halcombe spoke with the same flat candour he had produced the previous evening, adding no elaboration, softening nothing, and when it was done, he sat back in the chair with the expression of a man who has set down a weight he had been carrying for longer than his back could honestly sustain. Colonel March gave a separate account in the billiard-room, confirming what he had told Holmes privately, and Lestrade received it with the expression of a man who has been handed a case considerably more complicated than the one he was expecting, and is determining which parts of it fall within his professional remit. Julian Pike, his convenience as a suspect having dissolved entirely over the course of the morning, departed for London on the afternoon train, with an expression of relieved bewilderment, and said nothing to anyone that was worth recording. Miss Whitmore asked Ainsworth quietly whether she was still needed, and Ainsworth told her she was free to go when she wished, and she thanked him and went upstairs to continue her packing with the unhurried efficiency of a woman returning, without self-pity, to the practical business of her own arrangements. It was toward 4 o'clock, when Lestrade had completed the substance of his work for the day, and was conferring with Ainsworth in the library over the matter of Mrs. Beresford's involvement, and the precise legal question of whether her interference with the documents constituted an obstruction that the circumstances would sustain, that Holmes came to find me in the small sitting-room where I had been writing up my notes. "Come," he said, taking his coat from the stand by the door. "I want some air." We walked through the garden and out by a low gate in the rear wall onto a path that ran along the edge of the parkland, the ground still soft from the rain, and the trees above us still dripping at intervals in the windless afternoon. The sky had cleared during the hours of Lestrade's proceedings to the pale, washed blue that follows Surrey rain in late spring, and the light on the fields beyond the park had the particular quality of late afternoon in England, long and level and without heat, that I have always found more conducive to honest reflection than any more dramatic illumination. Holmes walked without speaking for some time, his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the middle distance, and I was content to match his pace and leave him to whatever he was working through. It was a companionship we had arrived at gradually over many years, the ability to be silent together without the silence becoming an absence. "She will not be charged," he said at last, without preliminary. "Ainsworth thinks the legal question is uncertain. The legal question may be uncertain. The practical question is not. The documents she altered were not court records in the formal sense, being private papers in the possession of a private individual. Her interference, while material, falls in a category that a prosecution would find exceedingly difficult to press, and a jury would find exceedingly difficult to condemn." He paused. "Lestrade knows this. He will record her account, note the circumstances, and allow the matter to rest, which is, in the circumstances, as much justice as the situation can honestly sustain." "Holmes," I said after a moment, "she altered those papers to protect people. She suppressed her husband's last act of conscience to protect people, and in doing so she was unknowingly acting on a calculation that had already been made for her by Halcombe, who had ensured that Sir Malcolm would never submit those documents regardless." "Yes," Holmes said, "she made her choice in the belief that she was making it freely, and it turned out she was making it in a room whose exits had already been locked by someone else. He looked out across the fields. There is a particular cruelty in that, which I suspect she has already identified, and which no court will be required to add to. We came to a place where the path turned and descended slightly toward a stream that ran along the lower boundary of the park, bordered by willows and running with a quiet urgency in the aftermath of the rain. Holmes stopped at the bank and looked at the water. "Kellard," I said, "a man who was careful and systematic and made one serious error of judgment." Holmes's voice had the quality of a man delivering not a verdict but an observation. He believed that accusation in company would protect him. He could not have known that the company in question would choose to close ranks rather than divide. He had, perhaps, too high an opinion of the social instinct for self-preservation, and too low an opinion of the loyalty that exists between men who have done profitable business together. And Sir Malcolm, at the end, Sir Malcolm Beresford did what he had not done at the beginning. He chose the truth over the convenience of silence, with full knowledge of what the choice would cost him and those around him. Holmes looked down at the moving water. That he was prevented from completing the choice does not diminish it. The intention, I think, counts for something. Not in law, but in the accounting that matters more. I did not ask him which accounting that was. I thought I understood him well enough. We stood by the stream for a little while in the late afternoon quiet, and then turned and walked back toward the house. As Beresford House came into view through the gap in the park wall, its stone pale in the low light, and its windows beginning to show the first reflection of the approaching evening, I thought of the people it contained, and what each of them would carry away from it. Halcombe, facing the conclusion of a professional life undone by a calculation that had served him for 25 years. March, released at last from the rigidity of a position held past all reason. Mrs. Beresford, alone in the house that had been the geography of a shared secret from the very first day of her marriage. "Holmes," I said as we came through the gate, "you said once that time rarely erases wrongdoing, that it merely dulls the voices of those who remember." "Did I? It sounds like something I might say at a railway station." He glanced at me briefly with something that was almost amusement. "It is true enough, as general propositions go. The Kellard case is a tolerable illustration. 25 years of silence, and the truth still found its way to the surface, not through any single dramatic event, but through the gradual accumulation of conscience in a man who could not, ultimately, leave the record as he had made it. And without your intervention?" He considered this with genuine care, which I had learned to distinguish from the performance of consideration. "Without my intervention, Halcombe would have been safe. The documents would have remained in their altered state. Mrs. Beresford would have lived out her widowhood without legal consequence. March would have continued to stand at firesides in borrowed houses with his hands behind his back." He paused. "And Thomas Kellard would have remained, in the official memory, a man who lost his footing on a slippery bank on a rainy October night, with no one responsible and nothing left to say." I thought of the river by Larkspur Mill, running as it had run for 25 years through the long seasons of silence, and of the small, persistent current of conscience that had moved against it all that time in the mind of an old magistrate at his desk. We went inside. Lestrade was in the hall with his coat on, his constable behind him, and Ainsworth at his shoulder with the look of a man who has spent a very long week and is beginning to see the end of it. "Holmes," Lestrade said, began with the combination of gratitude and reluctance that I had come to think of as his characteristic register in these endings. "Your written summary, the detail on the digitalis preparation, it is thorough." "I found the matter required precision," Holmes said. Lestrade nodded and moved to go, and then stopped, as he often did, with the air of a man who has one more thing and cannot decide whether to say it. "The widow," he said. "Whatever happened with those papers, it is a complicated business." "Most true things are," Holmes replied, and held open the door. We left Beresford House in the early evening light and rode to Thurlow Cross Station in a cab that smelled of damp leather and wood, and neither of us spoke very much until the lights of London were gathering outside the train window and Baker Street was half an hour away. Holmes had his eyes half closed and his long fingers pressed together in the familiar arch, and I sat with my notebook on my knee and thought about what I would write, and whether the full weight of what had occurred in that quiet Surrey house could be adequately rendered in any account I was capable of producing. I concluded, as I have concluded before, that it could not be rendered in full, but that the attempt, faithfully made, is owed to those who pass through such events, and deserve at least to have them remembered with accuracy and without false simplification. That is, as best I can manage it, what I have tried here to provide.